Welcome. So in this introduction, we're going to take a look at blood, and it's important. It's one of the most important diagnostic tools for trying to determine what's wrong with a patient. Patient comes in exhibiting various symptoms. Almost always they're going to do a blood draw. There's so many different variables that can change in your blood that can really clue in what's going on with your patient. Now, if I back up a slide, not enlarge it. If I back up a slide, there are lots of prefixes and suffixes found in this particular PowerPoint. It's a big PowerPoint, I know this, because we're going to get into blood and heart and cardiovascular system. But a lot of these words tell you what's going on. When we can break apart the word, a lot of times the words itself, although they look big, they look scary, if you can break it apart, the word will tell you exactly what it does or what it looks like, or a little bit more description about that particular thing it's trying to describe or be named for. And I'll try to break apart some of the words as we go through some of them as well. Now, what is blood? Well, it's a connective tissue. We went through the tissues, and this is the one really unique connective tissue because it's a fluid. Now, it's made up of kind of two separate entities. One, it's plasma. It makes up the majority, about 55% of it's non-living. It's just a fluid. We'll look at what's in plasma in a little bit. Then we also find formed elements. These are the cells, the living cells that are found mixed in with that plasma. Blood itself looks just like a homogeneous liquid. It all just looks like a big red liquid, but if we examine it closer, we notice that it is a liquid, and it's also cellular. There are cells. The top cells that are found in there, or the cells that are found in there, erythrocytes. Erythro means red. Anything cyte means cells, just red cells. Leukocyte, leuko means white, white cells. And we have platelets. Now the leukocytes and the platelets, if we spin our blood down, are found in what's now called the buffy coat part of the blood. Hematocrit, percentage-wise of what actually is in there for red blood cells. Red blood cells make up about 47% of blood volume in males and about 42% blood volume in females. And we'll talk a little bit about why there's that difference in percentage of red blood cells, male versus female. Now, some other characteristics about blood. It is a sticky, opaque fluid, and it has a metallic taste. Partly is because of the iron that we find in our hemoglobin. The color also varies with the oxygen content. If it's got a lot of oxygen, it's a bright scarlet red color. If there's less oxygen, it's a darker red. But my note on there is no blue. Blood is never blue, although it is depicted as that in lots and lots of A&P books. And part of that is because from the outside surface, you can have a bluish color when you have a decrease in oxygen content in your blood. However, the blood itself is not blue. Dark red, it has to do with physics. Dark red, when the light has to shine through our skin, go all the way through the skin, bounce off the blood vessels. If they bounce off of blood vessels that are really dark red, like dark brownish black red, that actually reflects back as a blue color. I'm like, it's just dark red. So blue really is showing dark red underneath the skin. It's just a light reflection. The pH of blood, very narrow range, 7.35 to 7.45, and it has to stay in that extremely narrow range. And blood volume, around 5 to 6 liters per male and 4 to 5 liters per female on average. Now, the top functions of blood: transporting things, regulating things in the body, and various aspects of protection. Now, the transport functions. Well, it transports and delivers oxygen and nutrients to the body cells. It can transport metabolic waste like carbon dioxide to lungs when you're breathing out. It can also transport other types of waste like nitrogenous waste to the kidneys for elimination each time you urinate. And it can also transport hormones from the endocrine organs to any target organs that they need to go to. For the regulation functions, it can help regulate and maintain your body temperature. It can absorb heat, and it can also distribute heat throughout the body into our skin surface. It's the main reason why when you get hot, your skin looks red, is we're trying to open up and dilate blood vessels near the surface of the skin to try to lose some of that heat. It can also help maintain your blood pH. It uses lots and lots of buffers. We have lots of buffers. We'll talk more about bicarbonate ions later, but it has lots of buffers so that it stays in that 7.35 to 7.45 range. It can also help maintain adequate fluid volume in our circulatory system. We don't want all of the blood to go into the tissues, so we have different blood proteins that regulate excessive loss of blood into various tissues. It also has some protection functions. It can help prevent blood loss. We've got plasma proteins, we've got platelets that all help to start clot formation to stop blood loss. It can also help prevent infections. We've got antibodies, we've got complement proteins that help out antibodies, targeting various types of foreign invaders, targeting them for destruction. And we also have various types of white blood cells that can recognize invaders and either target them for destruction or target something else to help them destroy foreign invaders. Now the plasma portion, the non-living portion of your blood, is about 90% water. Now, you can donate plasma. It's a kind of a yellowish straw color. However, they don't pay you the money for the water. Although, yes, it is 90% water, they are paying you for other stuff that's in your plasma. And some of that are some of the proteins, as well as other hormones, things like that. But the main thing that we find in all of that water are proteins. There's plasma proteins that hang out in the plasma of the blood. Some are produced in the liver and end up and stored in the blood. One of the top proteins we find in plasma is albumin, which, looking farther down on the slide, it has several functions that we'll see up in later units as well. It's a substance carrier. It's a protein that can carry other things. It's a blood buffer, helping maintain that narrow pH. It's also a contributor to our plasma osmotic pressure, which is the pressure that keeps water in the bloodstream. This, a lot of times, is given to patients to increase blood pressure and blood volume after surgery. So I'm like, it's a key protein that's given to patients a lot. Naturally, we have it in there, but obviously after a big blood loss after a surgery, we need to keep that blood pressure up, we need to keep the blood volume up, and albumin can help with that. We find the globulins, we find fibrinogen, which can help in blood clotting. There are some nutrients in there, there's gases, hormones, wastes, other types of proteins, some ions, lots of things found in plasma. Big things they pay you for some of the proteins, they pay you for some of those clotting factors. Other than the plasma part of the blood, part that's more interesting because it does a lot more stuff than plasma, are all the formed elements, are all the cells. Now, only the white blood cells are complete cells, meaning they have a nucleus. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus and are missing most organelles. And platelets were a cell at some point, but are now just cell fragments. Now, most formed elements, most cells survive in the bloodstream only a few days. Some can live longer than that, but they don't live forever. Most of them originate in our bone marrow, and they themselves don't divide. They're made in the bone marrow, they're released into the bloodstream, they head out, they do whatever they need to do, then they die, and we have to continually make more of them. This is just showing that the majority of the cells that you find in your blood are your red blood cells. That's all of the little pink circles. The fact that they look like little donuts with a white in the middle, that's because they are super, super thin there. They're thin in the middle. They are not, they aren't an actual donut. And I'm like, they don't have a hole, but they are really thin. So we can see a lot of light shining through them. Mixed among all these red blood cells, you can find several of our white blood cells or our platelets as well mixed in there. Now, the most abundant on there are our red blood cells, our erythrocytes, which again means red cells. And again, they're really thin in the middle. They're called biconcave discs, which means they dip in on each side. They don't have a nucleus. They're anucleate. That's one of the main reasons they dip in. The nucleus is the biggest organelle inside the cell. They're missing it. They're also missing most organelles as well. Diameters are larger than some of the capillaries, which means they can't always fit by themselves. Instead, they do have a plasma protein called spectrin found in there, and that spectrin allows it to change shape, to fold, and then to squeeze where it needs to go. So the spectrin protein allows them to be a little more flexible. They are filled with hemoglobin for gas transport, and they're the major factor that contributes to our blood viscosity, meaning how thick our blood is. Now, some other characteristics. One, that biconcave shape, the fact that it dips in on each side, gives it a great surface area. Now, the more surface area, the more places it can pick up oxygen and release it. Inside of our red blood cells, we find lots and lots of hemoglobin. Other than water, it's the top contributing compound found in red blood cells. It doesn't have any mitochondria. Any ATP that are made are all made anaerobic. They don't consume any oxygen that they transport, or they wouldn't be very good oxygen transporters if they used the oxygen they were trying to transport. But it's a nice example of your complementarity of structure and function. The fact that it's got that great surface area, it loses some of these, virtually useless organelles that it's figured out a way to get rid of them. It doesn't have to hold on to organelles it doesn't need. Now, it makes it such a great cell for picking up and transporting gases. Now, inside, the majority of the structure that's found inside of red blood cells are hemoglobin. Now, where the word hemoglobin comes from, the globin is a big old protein. I always think they look like globs. They look like 4 little globs. So it's composed of 4 polypeptide chains. 2 of them are called alpha chains, 2 of them are called beta chains. It's just the shape of the protein, but they look like globs. There's your 4 globs, your brown globin chains, and your beta, and then your 2 alpha. The heme pigment is a little tiny pigment found in the middle of each globe. I want to call it globin chain. So there's your heme group right in the center. Each heme iron that's found in there binds 1 oxygen molecule. So since one hemoglobin has 4 hemes, 1 hemoglobin can pick up 4 oxygen molecules. So you're like, well, that's not that much oxygen. Well, you also have to remember, 1 hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygen. Every red blood cell contains about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So, doing a little math, 1 red blood cell with its 250 million hemoglobin molecules that can each transport 4 oxygen can carry about 1 billion oxygen molecules. So, 1 red blood cell, billion oxygen molecules. Very efficient cell. Now, since it's carrying gases, and it's not only carrying oxygen, it can carry carbon dioxide as well. It's constantly picking up oxygen, it's constantly unloading oxygen. So it's picking up oxygen in the lungs, and when it picks up oxygen, it produces what we call as oxyhemoglobin. It just means hemoglobin that's picked up lots and lots of oxygen. It forms that nice bright ruby red color when oxygen binds to the iron. When it unloads the oxygen in the tissues, drops off oxygen where we need it, it produces something known as deoxyhemoglobin, or a reduced hemoglobin. We've lost some of the oxygen, it's not carrying as much, and it produces that dark red color. Now, it can also pick up and transport carbon dioxide. About 20% of all the carbon dioxide in our blood binds to hemoglobin. And when your red blood cells and the hemoglobin inside of them are picking up carbon dioxide in the tissues, it's called carboaminohemoglobin. I was thinking, it's got the carbon in there for carbon dioxide. It's hemoglobin that's picked up carbon dioxide. Now, it's instead of binding to the heme, the carbon dioxide doesn't bind to the heme part of the hemoglobin, it binds to amino acids. That's where the amino part. So it's carb for carbon dioxide binding to the amino acid part of hemoglobin. Hence the big, huge word carboaminohemoglobin. That is a mouthful to say. Now, we need to make red blood cells because they're not just naturally found there. Our red blood cells are all made in the red bone marrow. In adults, we find the majority of our red bone marrow in our axial skeleton, so kind of down the middle of the body. in our girdles, meaning, like the center part of the body that are attachments for our arms and legs, and in the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and the femur, is where we find lots of red bone marrow. Now, the cells that are going to be making our blood cells are called hematopoietic stem cells. Now, anything heme means blood. Anything with that poietic or poietin means making. So the word means making of blood stem cells. A hemocytoblast, blast means build, cyte means cell, heme means blood, building of blood cells. So these are the cells that give rise to all of our formed elements, meaning your hematopoietic stem cells can give us red blood cells, they can give us white blood cells, they can give us platelets, all the formed elements. It all just depends on various hormones and growth factors to determine which cell is going to be made. And then once it's committed to making a particular cell, it can't change back into some other type of cell. Now, our bone marrow churns out about an ounce of new blood every single day. And in an ounce of blood, you can easily have 100 billion new blood cells. That's a lot of cells we're making every single day. Now, starting it all off, it goes through various stages. Again, doesn't matter which type of cell it is, but for us right now, we're going to make red blood cells. But it's going to start off as that hematopoietic stem cell. And I'm like, the stem cell that can make any blood cell. Now, it's eventually going to get transformed into a pro-erythroblast. Pro meaning before, erythro meaning red, blast is building. We still haven't made the cell yet. But at this stage, it's now committed to becoming a red blood cell. It's got that erythra in it. In 15-ish days, about 2 weeks, they're going to develop into what are known as reticulocytes. I'm like, way down at the end, and I'm like, but there are several phases, several stages that it has to go through before it becomes a reticulocyte. It first has to accumulate a lot of ribosomes, then it starts to accumulate a lot of hemoglobin, then it will get rid of its nucleus. So it did have a nucleus at one point, then it spits it out, and then it becomes this reticulocyte where it's got lots of hemoglobin, it did have lots of ribosomes, and it got rid of its nucleus. Reticulocytes are sent out into the bloodstream, and then about 2 days later, they finally finish developing, and they look like what your mature red blood cells look like. The whole process takes about 2 weeks. And then you've got all these new red blood cells. Usually if they're looking at someone's red blood cells because they think there's not enough or there's too many, they're usually going to be looking for how many reticulocytes are sent out into the bloodstream to know if we're going to be making enough red blood cells. Now, that does mean we need to regulate how many red blood cells are made. Because I'm like, we don't want too few of red blood cells, or that leads to what's known as tissue hypoxia. Hypo meaning below, oxy meaning oxygen, which means you're not going to get enough oxygen in your tissues. Too many red blood cells increases your blood viscosity. Your blood becomes too thick, and that's not good to have too thick of blood. We make on average about 2 million red blood cells every single second. And there's a balance. We have to make enough, but not too many. And really what's helping control how many red blood cells are made is hormones and different types of vitamins, such as, adequate supplies of iron, amino acids, and vitamins. So pretty much your dietary needs. Now we're going to look at the hormones first. And there is one top hormone. Good to know it. It's nice and red on here. But it's a hormone known as erythropoietin. Again, erythro means red. Poietin or poiesis means making. So this is the hormone that's for making red blood cells. This is the hormone that's the direct stimulus for the making of red cells. Erythropoiesis just means making red blood cells. Erythropoietin is the hormone that does this. There's always a small amount of this particular hormone in our blood. It's to maintain that constant rate of about 2 million, every single second in our blood. We have to keep that high level because our red blood cells don't live forever. Things that can change how much red blood cell or how much erythropoietin is our blood If you have a lot of red blood cells already in your blood volume, you're going to have less of the hormone. It means we don't need to make as much because you already have lots of them. Or if there's a high level of oxygen, if there's a lot of oxygen present in the air around you, we don't need as many red blood cells because there's so much oxygen. The red blood cells that we do have are very efficient at picking up what is there. Now, the hormones made in the kidneys, some from the liver, but we'll mostly just talk about it as in the kidneys. And it's always released in response to hypoxia or a low amount of oxygen. Now, dialysis patients are always going to have a low red blood cell count. Again, dialysis patients is because their kidneys have stopped working, at least not worked enough, they're not working properly enough that they require dialysis. If your kidneys aren't working, there's some type of damage to it, there's going to be some type of damage to making of that hormone erythropoietin. Now, my little side notes on the bottom. There are some athletes that abuse artificial erythropoietin. That, yes, over the counter, and I'm like, you can actually get erythropoietin. Problem with that, I mean, the reason why an athlete would take erythropoietin is to stimulate making more red blood cells. The more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen you can carry, and it could help you run longer distances more efficiently, swim longer distances in the pool. Problem is, you have more red blood cells, which means your blood can become too thick, which means it might not get to the tissue it needs to get to because it's become so viscous and so thick that it can become deadly. Now, testosterone enhances how much erythropoietin is produced. This is why there are higher red blood cell counts in males than females, that they're on percentage-wise, males had a 47% red blood cell count, blood volume-wise, and females had 42. That's because testosterone makes more red blood cells, or triggers the hormone to make more red blood cells. Now, things that can cause us to make more of that erythropoietin, and I'm like, is hypoxia, low oxygen. So anything that causes hypoxia will eventually trigger making more red blood cells. Now, things that can cause hypoxia, because again, so maybe your kidneys aren't working or something, but things that can cause hypoxia or low oxygen in your body. Well, if there was a decrease in your red blood cell numbers, maybe it was because hemorrhaging, maybe it's because something that was destroying your red blood cells, a virus, a bacteria, some other type of disorder happening in your body that causes red blood cell destruction, you would have hypoxia, not enough oxygen to your tissues. If you had insufficient hemoglobin per red blood cell, it can happen if there's not enough iron in your diet. You're not going to have as many hemoglobin, you're not going to have your 250 million per red blood cell. This is called anemia, is when you've got that low iron, which means you have a low hemoglobin count. Or if you're just somewhere where there's not as much oxygen, if you go to higher altitudes, there's not enough oxygen. It can cause hypoxia. Different conditions like pneumonia can cause hypoxia, that there's fluid in your lungs and you can't get the oxygen to cross the tissue because of all the fluid in there, so you're not getting enough oxygen in your body. Now, if you're going into hypoxia, it can trigger the making of erythropoietin. We hope, if everything works. So your stimulus is hypoxia, not enough oxygen in your body where it needs it. That low oxygen will trigger your kidney to release the hormone erythropoietin. The hormone will go to its target organ, the red bone marrow, and then in the red bone marrow, it will trigger the making of more red blood cells. And so your red blood cell count will go up. You're going to have more red blood cells in your blood volume, and more red blood cells, more oxygen carrying capacity, and then hopefully we'll level right back out with our normal blood oxygen levels. So we need erythropoietin to make red blood cells. Now, another thing that is required other than hormones for making of red blood cells are your dietary needs. So you have to have a well-balanced diet. And you need amino acids and proteins in your diet. You need lipids, you need carbohydrates, all required in making red blood cells. You need iron. Some of it's available from your diet. And some of it, Well, some of it we can store in the body and we can use when we need it. I was going to say about 65% of all the iron in your body is found in your hemoglobin. Some of it's stored in your liver, some in your spleen, some in your bone marrow. None of it floats around in your body as free iron ions. It's always going to be bound to something else because free iron is toxic. We also need vitamin B12 and we need folic acid. It's necessary for DNA synthesis, especially when you're making cells. You need more DNA if you're making and dividing new cells. Now, once we make red blood cells and we send them off to go do everything they need to do, they're going to hang out in your bloodstream for about 100 to 120 days. And I'm like, and again, that's on average. They don't grow, they don't divide, they don't make proteins. Their job is to float around, pick up oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, deliver those to wherever they need to go. So they hang out for 3-4 months. As they start to get in, around that 100-day mark, they start to become fragile. The hemoglobin starts to break down. They also then start to lose their flexibility. Some of them start to get trapped in some of the smaller circulatory channels. Some of them get stuck in the spleen. That's fine. And I'm like, they eventually go to the spleen to die and get fully broken down. There are macrophages. These are big eating cells that will see some of these dying red blood cells and they'll break them down, they'll eat them, and they'll take them to the spleen, the red blood cell graveyard. As it starts to get broken down, we try to recycle as much as we can. So we're going to take that hemoglobin, we're going to break it down, it's going to get separated into its heme and the globin. The iron's going to get reused later. The heme part will start to break down, it gets degraded into a yellow pigment called bilirubin. The liver is going to secrete the bilirubin in bile into your intestines. So that bilirubin that the liver secretes into the intestine, well, that comes from the breakdown of your red blood cells. Now, as that bilirubin goes into the intestines, it gets broken down into a pigment called bilinogen. And then eventually that leaves as a pigment in your feces known as stercobilin. Now, stercobilin is a brown pigment. This is why it pretty much doesn't matter what you eat, your feces is always brown. And I'm like, it's because you're always breaking down red blood cells. So the fact that your feces is always brown is the fact that you are always breaking down red blood cells. The globin part of hemoglobin, it's a protein. It gets broken down to its simpler amino acids. They get released into circulation. It can be used elsewhere in the body. Now, some disorders that can come from your red blood cells. Well, the one big one is anemia, is that you have a low oxygen carrying capacity. Now, anemia itself is not a disease. It's a sign. Pretty much it's a sign something else isn't working. It means the blood oxygen levels cannot support normal metabolism. Some of the symptoms of having anemia, you're tired, you're fatigued, you're pale, you have shortness of breath, you can have chills. I'm like, and again, it's all because you've got a low oxygen carrying capacity. Now, there are lots of reasons to have anemia. Sometimes it's because of blood loss. If you've had surgery, if you've had some type of major accident, even if you've had like a chronic bleeding ulcer, it's a slow, gradual loss of blood all the time. If you've got a low red blood cell production, maybe you didn't have enough iron in your diet, or maybe you didn't have enough vitamin B12 in your diet, and I'm like, you wouldn't have enough red blood cells. Maybe you have a high red blood cell destruction, and I'm like, it happens if you've had a mismatched transfusion of blood. We would start, your body would start rejecting red blood cells and start destroying them. Maybe it's a bacterial viral infection or some other type of abnormality in your hemoglobin, like sickle-cell anemia. Now, sickle-cell anemia, again, it's a type of anemia, and I'm like, it comes because in making of the red blood cell, we need the hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is a protein. Proteins are made of amino acids. Well, in sickle-cell anemia, when we try to make that globin part of the hemoglobin, one of the amino acids is wrong. And because that one amino acid is wrong in the sequence of amino acids, the red blood cell, the hemoglobin doesn't allow the red blood cell to maintain its normal shape. And so the red blood cells become crescent shaped, like half moon or like crescent moon shaped, when they drop off oxygen or if your blood oxygen level is low. They rupture easily. They can start to block small blood vessels, which means if you've got blood vessels, like you're usually going to have lots of pain because blood is not getting to various tissues. They can also cause strokes. It can lead to various types of infections because you're not monitoring, or your immune system's not being able to monitor different types of tissues if it can't get to it. Now, black people of the African malarial belt and descendants are kind of seem to be the ones that have this abnormality with their amino acid chain. Now, and I've got a picture on the next slide that kind of shows these amino acid chains. Malaria itself kills 1 million people each year. The interesting part about malaria, because malaria is a protozoan disease, people that have sickle-cell anemia, if genetic-wise you carry 2 copies of this abnormality making the protein correctly, you're going to suffer the full sickle-cell anemia. The interesting part is, for example, if your mom had sickle-cell anemia and your dad didn't, so you only got 1 copy of the gene that causes this, you'll have sickle-cell anemia, but a milder disease. It's usually not going to cause a lot of severe symptoms. But the interesting part is that those that just have this milder version, because they only have 1 copy of the gene, have a better chance of surviving the protozoan infection that causes malaria. And so it's one of those that, well, yes, it is a genetic abnormality, but it's, case-wise, it can actually save a lot of lives depending if you live in an area where malaria is predominant. Now, this is where I was talking. This is a big old chain of amino acids. These are 3-letter abbreviations for all the amino acids, 146 different amino acids to make part of that hemoglobin. Out of 146 amino acids, if we change number 6, just number 6 is wrong. Everything else is correct, but just having that 1 amino acid difference causes that red blood cell to have that crescent shape. And it breaks apart, it gets clunked and, clogged up and blocks some of those blood vessels. Now, treating it's treatable. One, they can do some transfusions, and again, it depends kind of where you are and how severe it is. If you inhale nitric oxide, that can stimulate making of correct red blood cells. They can try to, prevent that sickling, that folding over of the red blood cells. They can block red blood cell ion channels. They can do stem cell transplants. And then they're even now doing gene therapy. They're trying to deliver genes to the stem cells so that we've got the genes to make correct hemoglobin structures versus having that one incorrect one, because all it comes down to is DNA sequence. Now, most of the treatments are some type of drug, some type of prescription drug, but there are treatments. It's definitely survivable. Now, some review: red blood cells. After centrifuging all of your blood, of the listed blood component, which one contains the components of your immune function? So what part of your blood are you going to find components of the immune function? And that would be the buffy coat, because the main part of your blood that helps with your immune system are your white blood cells. And that's found in the little thin buffy coat area of your blood. A major function of the most common plasma protein, albumin, is both A and B, both pink and orange, maintaining your plasma osmotic pressure and help with buffering in that plasma pH. I know it's long. Red blood cells are efficient oxygen transport cells of the following characteristic, which is the major contributor to the significant oxygen carrying capacity of a red blood cell. So of these, which one makes it such a great oxygen carrying cell? The big thing is they've got that awesome surface area because they have their biconcave discs. Each hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygen atoms. Oxygen binds to the iron atom of the hemoglobin. A patient with low iron levels would experience which of the following symptoms? Biggest symptoms, this is anemia. If you've got low iron, you're going to have an increase in fatigue. Predict the outcome of an overdose of the hormone erythropoietin. And again, the word means, erythro means red, poietin or poiesis means making of red blood cells. If you have too much of this particular hormone, you're going to increase your blood viscosity. And if it becomes viscous or thick enough, it can trigger heart attacks and strokes, both being deadly. Now, after this, we get into the white blood cells, but intro-wise, we're going to end right there talking about the red blood cells.